Since I paid for the mics, I want to ask the first question, and this would apply to anybody. I'd love to hear anybody's reaction because this is not something we brought up. This relates mainly to affirmative asylum claims, and this is the issue of safe third country. I mean, it seems to me that no one who has arrived from the Frankfurt airport or Heathrow or Paris or, frankly, Mexico should even be permitted to make an asylum claim because they should have made the claim in the country they passed through beforehand. And we have we have a safe third country agreement, sort of, with Canada, which is fine. I guess it's a place to start. But it seems to me that there's, as far as affirmative claims from people arriving at the United States, I'm not sure there's any place other than maybe somebody who came from Haiti directly on a boat who has any grounds to even make an asylum claim, since they should have done so in Germany or in Spain or in Mexico or in Japan. And I just wanted to get people's reaction to that. Anybody have any thoughts?
Well, I'd be interested in Michael's view as somebody who's on the front lines. But I will say, it seems to many observers that there's been a willful willingness on the part of the government to overlook statutory requirements. One of the statutory requirements is that people making asylum claims at port of entry should be detained until their asylum claim is adjudicated. That is not, even though it's in the laws of the United States, that is not being complied with. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that, yeah, the laws of the United States do provide that people who come through a safe third country should not be eligible to make asylum claims. It doesn't shock the conscience that, oh, that's not being observed either. The reality is, we could, even in the absence of a third-party agreement, put people back on the airplane. But often, it takes so long to adjudicate the case that the practicality of that remains to be seen. I will note that this is an issue within the EU also. Even within the EU, they're fighting over where asylum claims should be made, and trying to enforce the rule that you can't pass through a safe country on your way to your country of choice to make your asylum claim. I think if we, as a government, wanted to take a stand on that issue, the legal apparatus is in place for doing so. I take Michael's point to heart that there is a democratic process at work in this country which determines our laws, and our laws that are in place today have been developed through that democratic process and are entitled to respect. If Congress wants to change it, they can change it. But until they change it, the laws of the United States are the laws of the United States and ought to be respected as the product of our democratic process.
I agree with that, and in furtherance of the notion of resettlement, it smacks of a kind of selectivity on the part of the person who is allegedly in flight that is, it seems to me, in contradiction to the notion that they are, in fact, fleeing from oppression if they pick and choose where they want to land. It seems to me that if there is truly a danger to the person's family, that they will land where they need to gain succor. Later, they can give thought to emigrating through the other available legal means to get where they want to go. But if they are truly fleeing persecution, then being picky-choosy kind of flies in that notion to my way of thinking. And the corollary that bothers me a great deal is that once someone has gained refugee or asylee status, there seems to be an overlooking of the fact that many of them find their way back to the country from which they were claiming persecution. There's a stamp in the passport when they arrive at the port of entry, either out of indifference or ignorance or deliberation. CBP officers, as inspectors, don't say, wait a minute, explain this to me. How is it, Mr. Tsarnaev, that you went back to the place that you claimed, to be fleeing from? How does that work for you? I find that is the kind of thing that casts ill repute on all of the associated refugee asylee withholding programs in their entirety. And I think in the end, it will not redound to the benefit of an honest, robust program that the United States can be proud of.
Michael, you have any thoughts on the safe third country idea?
Well, I'm reminded of Professor Fisher and the St. Louis.
Right.
There were quotas and limitations. There was not a robust international refugee protection system, and there was no safe third country.
If I may,
just to finish the thought, you could say that was 70 years ago and the world has changed, but one of the ways the world has changed is that we now do have an international protection system. But in order to keep it going, keep it alive, and keep it robust, it's going to require a lot of work. And I think that's what we're talking about now, is to make sure that system does what it's supposed to do. And in order for there to be safe third country mechanisms, it's going to require a lot of cooperation with those partners. But simply for one country to unilaterally act apart from those partnerships is a perilous route to take.
I was going to say, there's an interesting article in the most recent version of the New York Review of Books, and it's about Franklin Roosevelt and whether he was anti-Semitic or, at minimum, not sufficiently attuned to the plight of European Jews. And it speaks at some level of detail to the St. Louis. And I was surprised that the facts that are laid out about the St. Louis are not precisely the same as the myth that you and I have heard with some frequency. So I would encourage you to go back and read that article.
Yeah, I don't want to get in a debate
No,
about the 1930s.
I'm only saying.
But I mean, I would only add before I open it to questions is that the issue, I mean, what we're talking about is somebody who's, let's say, from West Africa. You know, they end up in, first of all, they travel to several countries in West Africa, then end up in France, then get on an airport and a plane in France and move here. I see no moral justification, literally, for granting, even considering an asylum application from somebody like that, because they had an obligation, if they were genuinely fearing for their lives or liberties, to apply for asylum in France. I mean, I'm not even arguing the sort of the mechanics or the legal tools. I'm saying even the very principle of asylum seems to me illegitimate for somebody in that situation.
In response to that, that is the European view. I think that asylum should be claimed in the country, the first safe country that you come to, and they're trying to persuade the Italians of that, and the Italians are resisting, saying, no, everyone comes to Italy first. They shouldn't have to make their claim in Italy. We don't want
Or the
to
Maltese,
handle all these asylum claims, but increasingly that is the European view. And indeed, in the United States, our statute does engage in wishful thinking in providing for multilateral agreements and saying that, oh, if you can sign an agreement with some third country, then we can send people back to wherever they originated in. And as Mark says, we've only been able to sign such an agreement with one country, Canada, and that took years and years and years of negotiation. So we finally have an agreement with Canada. So if somebody flies into the United States from Canada and says they want to claim asylum, we can say, no, you just flew in from Toronto. Go back to Toronto and make your claim there. And of course, the Canadians can do the same thing. If people fly
And I would
in.
note that numerically, the country of those two countries that is getting the largest number of people arriving at their shores is the United States.
not
So
Canada.
Canada gains the benefit of that
Yes.
lopsided negotiation.
Which is also why European countries have been unwilling to sign such an agreement with the United States. There aren't a whole lot of people flying from the United States to Western Europe to claim asylum, and the Europeans know that. But, hope springs eternal, and we still have that language in our statute. So if anyone wants to sign an agreement with us, the United States is anxious to do so.
Okay, let me open it if anybody has any questions. Yes? And then you, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, in the back.
So I was just wondering, since so much seems to depend on an interview and people stating things, and I mean, if people are good at rehearsing their story, that would be very hard to disprove. Is there any document you could hope for in these situations proving, they are who they say they are, they left, their life was what they said it was, even if they crossed not through a port, that they came the way they said they came? Like, are there any documents you could ask for? I'm just kind of.
Could I know who you are?
Yeah, I'm Julie Axelrod from the Federation of American Immigration Reform.
Yeah, you can ask for, we can and do ask people for documents. I mean, first of all, we ask to establish their identity, which is really key to the whole process. And then, of course, we ask, do you have any documents to substantiate your claim, which, depending on what it is, you're going to ask for different documents. But you have to also, I mean, this is our training and our experience as an asylum officer, take into account that in well-established in international law, sometimes people who are in flight must resort to obtaining fraudulent documents simply to obtain a foothold somewhere else. So you have to sift through that whole thing. I mean, you could have a truly legitimate refugee who obtained a false passport, false identity, simply to get out of the country that was seeking their demise. And the classic example would be the famous Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who, in the last years of World War II issued something like 17,000 Swedish passports to Hungarian Jews to protect them from deportation. So we have in our training, in our matrix of what we have to look at, the question of materiality. What is the material relationship of the document to true identity, true story, and so on? Someone might have used a fraudulent document, but their telling of that story, if credible, could lend credence to their claim. On the other hand, sometimes we ask for documents, and you know what? People can go and get any document they want. If you ask for it, if you make that the standard, they can go get them, right? It might be a real document, it might not be a real document. And so we are challenged constantly with that. We've got, a robust relationship with our forensic document labs and our fraud people, but there's always ultimately that human transaction that has to take place where you have to make a difficult credibility call looking at the totality of the circumstances.
I
It's
don't.
not an easy answer.
No, it isn't, and I don't suggest that there is an easy answer, but I would also note that when Michael talks about the value of, fingerprinting, photographing, and registering, which is, of course, a part of the asylum or refugee process, the downside is that because you're dealing with at-risk populations in unsettled, areas of the world, you may sometimes accord someone a registry under a completely fictitious identity and thus create for them the identity that they want created. And it's difficult to know that you've done that unless something horrible and untoward happens. So registry has its good side, but registry also helps embed someone in the system in a way that creates an identity for them that they may not have had previously.
When Michael and I were working together to set up the Asylum Officer Corps back in the early 90s, the State Department was involved in the process of considering asylum claims. That is no longer the case now, as I understand it. And I think the State Department welcomes that. They did not want to have any responsibility for asylum claims on their plate. But one of the suggestions I made in my testimony to the House Judiciary Committee in December was that some sort of role for the State Department should be carved out in the asylum process. They should have the opportunity to weigh in on cases that they choose to weigh in. I wouldn't make it an obligation on their part, knowing that they're not anxious to take on this responsibility. But they should have the opportunity to weigh in. I mean, the reality is we have trained Foreign Service officers all over the world who speak the language, who live in the country, who can, if they choose to, look at the asylum claims that are being made and express an opinion. Yeah, this sounds right, or this doesn't sound right. There's something wrong with this claim, or we've seen this claim before all the time. This is a common story that's told in wherever. And I think one of the short-term modifications we might consider is providing a role, an opportunity, if you will, for the Foreign Service officers who we trust to represent our interests all over the world to weigh in, if they choose, on asylum claims.
Yep.
I'm Jack Martin, and I'm one of those State Department people who had a role in providing advisory opinions on asylum claims at one point in time. And I certainly would agree with Professor Ting that it would be a very worthwhile role for the State Department to resume. But my question basically is, would you care to comment on the growing split between entry into the refugee program as opposed to asylum? The reason for that question is that that both programs are based upon the same definition, basically, and the asylum policy was set up simply to deal with people who were already in the country that basically met the same definitions as somebody who would be eligible for the asylum program. But because of actions both by Congress and by our court system, a growing divergence has evolved between the two programs. Examples of the congressional actions are the Cuban Adjustment Program, treating all Cubans as if they were refugees, even though everybody knows that that's not the case. The one-child family planning policy of China, incorporated as law, giving those people a claim to asylum in the United States, which is not a part of the international practice of the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. Examples on the court systems is the granting family abuse entry into the United States asylum protections that are not part of the international system. It seems to me that all of those areas in which there's a divergence between the international standard and national practice are areas that really merit close look in terms of any sort of reform.
I tend to agree with you, and Professor Ting spoke earlier about cost-benefit analysis. And quite frankly, if I was an alien and I had any opportunity to land my feet at a port of entry, whether it was, air, sea, you name it, I would prefer to apply for asylum, not refugee status. You're likely in a refugee camp. You're going to have to wait for UNHCR or one of its contract agencies to assist you. You're going to have to wait to be funneled to this country or that country for an interview. You're going to face a cap, whereas none of that applies if you can show up at a port of entry, or even if you cross surreptitiously through the southern border and you're here and you can make your claim within 1 year's time. It's much to your advantage to do that. So in a certain sense, that divergence has acted as a magnet.
The big difference between our overseas refugee program and our asylum program, even though they meet the nominal same standard, is that the United States has never represented our willingness to take everyone who meets even the international standard in the overseas refugee program. Our position has always been, we'll take our fair share of the people who meet that standard. And as opposed to the asylum program, where we basically represent everyone who meets the international standard in an expansive way, as you've outlined, even beyond the international standard, they will qualify for asylum. They will qualify for discretionary asylum, 100% of them, and so that's the big difference between the two programs.
Well, this is really not a comment on quotas or whatnot, but by signing the Refugee Convention, what distinguishes the two is that when someone lands on our shore and makes an application, we are obligated by that convention to give them a due process to hear their claim and not arbitrarily return them to, their possible risk, which is very different than, as you said, going to a refugee camp where we have no sovereignty and it's really an international partnership to take one's fair share, which is really only a drop in the bucket. We're looking at, 20 million, I think current average is 20 million refugees in camps, warehoused all over the world, and the United States and its partners only take a very small portion of those. But it's fundamentally different when they arrive on our shores, and then we then have a treaty obligation.
Any other questions?
Mark, I have a question for Mr. Knowles, and then maybe one of you can comment on it as well.
And you are?
I'm sorry, I'm Marguerite Telver. I work for the Center for
Oh,
Immigration
you talked
Studies.
to her, yeah. Yes.
Sorry. Welcome. The fraud rate is high. The fraud rate is extremely high. And it seems from your talking, you have total trust in the integrity of the system, and you feel like the workers are very vigilant. And the only thing you really talk about is you need more time. If time would actually allow us to rectify the problem, if that's all it takes, it's not a policy problem or anything else, if that's all it takes is time, how do the people you represent feel about how the incredible fear policy is being used? I mean, if they actually use that as a way to cut off all those that are coming through, instead of having, what is it, 92%, I think it was, acceptance rate on the incredible fear now, how can that be done differently to help you find the time you need?
There's about 5 questions. So let me.
We'll pick one of them,
Pick-
then. Go ahead, because we want to wrap it
Well,
up.
first of all, I don't subscribe to total trust in the system. The system is a system. To make the system work, it's coming to work every day and all of us working together to make it work. And it's always going to be imperfect. It's always going to be gamed. And it's always going to require vigilance to make sure, as I said, the screen is operating. But it's never going to be fail-safe. All I was saying is we have probably one of the most robust processes in the immigration system. Is it gamed? Yeah. Is it fraught with, potential loopholes that someone might exploit? Yes. That's why they have us doing this job. And it requires tremendous amount of cooperation between agencies, state, local, international, to make it work. And it will never work perfectly. So that's the first thing. When I say we need more time to make it work as well as we can, to try to make the best decisions that we can. Not asking for, weeks and weeks to do one case, but it would be nice to have a little more time to do the many cases that we have. And that really means more people. I'm sorry?
And what kind of impact could we expect on the fraud rate? I mean,
Well, when you say fraud rate, that's
fraudulent application.
Well, what is, then you have to get into what is a fraudulent application. So what I said earlier about, a real refugee might commit fraud in order to save themselves. So you have to, get down deeper in the weeds to say, is it fraud that goes to the materiality of their claim? Is it fraud that underscores that they've gamed the system and it's a frivolous claim? You have to get down in the weeds on each case. So more time, would help. More people doing the work would help, and better cooperation between the different entities who do this would help. But is there an ultimate fix? I don't think there is.
So that 92% acceptance of applications with the
That's for
incredible
the credible fear,
For
right.
incredible fear. I mean, that's an increase over the years, right?
I am not watching the statistics of the program like others, but I think there is some confusion in the debate about the credible fear program and the affirmative asylum program. They're really not the same. And I think our partners on the panel, Mr. Cadman's paper explains those differences. Mr. Ting does, but I think in a short discourse like this, sometimes the distinction is not there. So if you see, I mean, I have personally not done credible fear interviews since they were instituted in the 90s, just because I'm doing a lot of other asylum work or union work. But the process is very similar. The intent, as Mr. Ting talked about, was to try to streamline a process so that you could get people who had a possible claim in front of the appropriate adjudicating authority, which the law says is the court, so that we could get in. It's basically a screening process. We're not granting asylum to people through credible fear. They're not granted asylum. They're granted an opportunity to get their case heard in court. And so, yeah, there is, I wouldn't say there's pressure for us to approve everybody, but there's pressure placed on us by the volume, and you've talked about some of the different reasons for the volume. There's also the reason that you look at the papers every day and see what's driving people away from their countries. It's a complicated mix here, but we're not just rubber stamping people to give them asylum. We're trying to move them quickly, those who might have a claim, to get in front of the judge. Then you get into all the questions of detention policy. Should they be detained? Should they be released? That's way beyond, I think, the scope of, what I'm really capable of addressing. But as far as your initial question about fraud rate, I can't control the fact that people might commit fraud, but I am tasked with the very difficult job of trying to figure out when it happens, why it happens, how does it apply to the case in front of me, and what can we do about it. But if anybody said I'm turning a blind eye, or any of my colleagues are turning a blind eye, or even if anyone was to say our authorities were telling us to turn a blind eye, I would object to that.
My concern is that because there are so many discrete places and portions of this system which should be considered holistically as a fine, like a clock mechanism, that all the gears have to work well together, that if each is handled discretely but differently, the clock doesn't work. And I think that's what's happening. And my other concern is that, yes, it's true that credible fear is a different thing than actually making the decision on the asylum, but the one drives the other. If credible fear begins to be looked at as something that you can give it because later somebody else has to make the final decision, and in the meantime you can get and forgive me, but you can get the paperwork off your desk and maybe even sidestep that hard decision about, I could send you back to your death. Maybe it is easier sometimes to say, I'm going to pass you on credible fear so that the IJ can make that tough decision. Is that at work? I don't know. What I do know statistically is that there is something at play that wasn't there before, both in terms of numbers and in terms of statistics showing what's being passed as approved, whether it's for that moment of the credible fear or the affirmative claim in front of an asylum officer, in front of an immigration judge, whatever. And it does smack back to the days that Jan spoke of when people would get on a flight, an Air France flight, land at JFK, they flush their documents down the toilet in the meantime. They get off, they say, I want asylum. And at that point in time, because there was no credible fear, there was no mandatory detention, they would walk through the international area and be paroled out the door and await a hearing that would be many, 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 many months up the road. And that certainly is a commonality with what goes on now. Even if you don't get, I beg pardon?
With the work permit.
After 180 days, yes. And you're
Now.
not going to be heard in 180 days. That's not happening. So,
No, Go ahead, finish what you were saying. Yeah,
I'm done.
okay. Jan, just last
Yeah,
comment. and then I
back
wanna
in the day,
respect
of course, they
people's
didn't even have the 180-day requirement. They just got the work permit right away. I just wanted to say, when I go out and speak, which I do less and less these days, I often hear from asylum officers, former and present, and they say pretty much what Michael says, that they feel very much under pressure to move the caseload along. And they're being evaluated on processing, how quickly they can process the cases. And they make the connection, and they say sometimes they would like to take more time on a case. If they see they have concerns about fraud, they would like to pursue them, but they're under pressure. Move the case along. That they're being evaluated on how many cases they can clear. They wish they had more time to pursue concerns about fraud, and they don't have enough time. And I think that strikes me, based on my anecdotal conversations with people, to be a common concern. And maybe it's always been there. Maybe it was there from the old days too. The need to move the cases along. I know we had a big backlog in the early days that we were trying to clear out too. So maybe that's always been there. But it seems to me, a contributing factor to the incidence of fraud in the system.
Jan, thank you for that support of what we do. I did have, if I
Okay,
could,
quickly, yeah, one last
comment that I think is often a misconception about the rubber stamp, thought. There's a perception that, we're under pressure to decide a certain way. And that's always a struggle, that's all in human error. I have found, however, that's usually more at the supervisory level. I might have a disagreement with my supervisor about a case, and I usually, I take great pride in the decisions that I make, and I've said for 22 years, the day that I'm told how many I may or may not approve or deny arbitrarily is the day I resign. I've been given great training. They hired me because of my skills. I'm given a great deal of discretion. We do have 100% supervisory review of our caseload, which is unlike any other process, to make sure that we're doing it correctly administratively. But ultimately, if we've done it administratively correctly, we've done our security checks, it's a legally sufficient decision, the discretion is usually respected of the officer. And sometimes there's a healthy debate, but I can say I've never been ordered to change my decision, up or down. I've had those robust debates. And it's always one that I think those debates keep our system healthy.
Okay, well, thanks. We could keep talking about this for a long time, but I want to respect people's time. I want to thank all the panelists. Dan's paper is online at our website, cis.org, and thanks for coming.